Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Wednesday, and that means Epic Comic Book Wednesday, when Michael K. Vaughan and I team up to talk about comic books, some comic theme or character or subject or a run on a comic or a reprint line. Uh, it started on Mike's channel. He was doing an overview of Marvel's Epic collection line, their full color reprint line, going back on their back catalog. Really good paperback volumes. He has hundreds of them. I have just a couple of dozen. He has hundreds of them. Uh, I horn my way in, and because I'm an interloper, he gets to pick what we talk about. And we had a subject planned for today, uh, and it was a Michael K. Vaughan type subject. I was eager to talk about it anyway. I usually am. But at the last minute, he changed our subject to not only, well, it's connected to a Michael K. Vaughan subject, but not only is it a Steve subject, but it is the Steve subject. He changed our subject today to Superboy. And not any of the characters that come to your mind if you were born in the 21st century and you hear that name, to Superboy. The Adventures of Superman when he was a boy, which started at the end of World War II and took off, became really popular, and which, if you were a little boy reading comics in the American Midwest in the 50s, you would absolutely have loved. Here was a teenage boy with an indestructible dog, and believe you me, the idea of an indestructible dog is really appealing. Really appealing. Because they're not indestructible. Uh, but here was this boy with his dog in the American Midwest, just having tons and tons of adventures. It was a fascinating subject. It was created by the creators of Superman, who thought they looked at at the huge success of Robin, the Boy Wonder, and said, well, a little of that, a little more of that would be good. Let's have another boy hero. Only Superboy is not anybody's ward. He's not anybody's assistant. In fact, during the world of the Superboy comic books, as far as he knows, he's the only superhero on Earth. The only person with superpowers. It's said over and over again in his adventures. Which, I mean, I of course went on eBay. But if you had been that little boy, well, he would have battered old copies of these issues that are barely holding together. And there you have Super Baby, I mean, without the symbol. But Super Baby's just on the cover here. Superboy has most of the adventures because, like a lot of other things that we've seen, these were anthology comics. So you got 4 or 5 stories in each one, plus a bunch of other stuff. For your 12 cents, which was half of your weekly allowance. Uh, these stories, over and over again, characters in these stories say that Superboy is the only person in the world who has superpowers. So if someone shows up, as someone does about every 4 issues, a teenage boy will show up who has superpowers. People automatically suspect that it is Superboy. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. In this particular story, which I'm sorry is falling apart, uh, a mad scientist, or not a mad scientist, just a scientist father, figures out a way to give his son superpowers. And it's a really touching story. It's really, really good. And it's one and done. Superboy is not traumatized. He does not think about this character again. No other person references this. The scientist father does not dig up the dead body of his son and clone it and turn it into a universe-wrecking monster who can step between multiple realities and pull them down by the corners at will, and who can only be stopped by the serialized death of little children. Whatnot. All modern comics, nothing like that happens. Instead, you get a 6-page story about the boy who was braver than Superboy, and then you move on to the next story in that issue, another 6 pages. Maybe there's a diamond thief in Smallville. Superboy doesn't go anywhere. He can go anywhere. He has the powers of a god. This is the old style Superman, the old style Kryptonians whose superpowers are basically limitless. Kryptonite will hurt them, but otherwise they can do anything, go anywhere, and Superboy could do that, but he doesn't. Instead, he stays at home with Ma and Pa Kent, doing chores, and going to high school. And at high school, he has friends and he has enemies. He is already adopted his nerdy Clark Kent persona, so he's often picked on by the other kids at school. Lana Lang is his neighbor and also is incurably curious as to whether or not Clark Kent and Superboy are the same person. Uh, he has an army of robots, just like Superman would for a long time have an army of robots who call him Master. Uh, and he has just adventures, one after another, 3 in one issue, and then 3 in the next issue. As you can tell, this is Superboy, but Superboy was also was popular enough, so he was in Adventure Comics too. Adventure Comics was first, and then he had his own book, and it took off. They both did. Superboy was a popular character, and it was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But I guess, I mean, Michael K. Vaughan, I'm sure that he's made his video already. He makes his videos at the crack of dawn before he goes to work all day. Show me dedication like that, I swear. But I'm sure there is Lana Lang. There is Superboy being pummeled by the fists of fury. And there she is, wondering what's going on there. Here is Superboy as a delinquent, holding up a car, and you can see the 1950s slang there. Metropolis or bust. Oh, you kid, hold that tiger. That sort of slang shows up throughout all of these things. And in I think the first issue of Superboy the comic, not Superboy's first appearance. I think the first issue of Superboy the comic, a little tot Superboy runs at super speed and says, "Let somebody run who can run." And in 2025, that will just seem like an odd, saucy thing to say. You will have no idea of the election year echoes and whatnot. But these issues, it was just one bombarded idea after another. You got Crypto the Superdog. You got the Legion of Superheroes, of course. My beloved Legion of Superheroes premieres in a Superboy story in Adventure Comics. Now that I've got other props here. That eventually changed. The Legion became so popular. The Legion, I've talked about it many times on this channel. They are a team of dreamy teenagers 1,000 years in the future. And they decide to go back in time and induct Superboy into their group. So the book eventually became Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, where he became the headliner in his own book, but not the only star. And Legion fans kept asking for more. At one point, DC Comics had the idea to give the Legion their own book, and split Superboy off into his own book. And it went on from there. Those 2 titles went on from there, and it was a joy, an absolute joy. It was getting more and more serious. Of course, by the time this appeared, the Stan Lee virus had already struck comic books. Same thing with this one, where all of a sudden every comic book issue is connected to every other comic book issue, and characters can undergo trauma. And characters can get beaten to a pulp, and characters can die, and characters can, as the original Superman does, get beaten to a pulp, get beaten to death at the fists of a nihilistic version of Superboy. That's great. For the very first superhero, the one that started it all, that is the canonical end in DC Comics, because the writers were allowed by their editors to just do whatever the hell they want with these characters when they absolutely shouldn't be able to do that. But things were trucking along, and I was having a blast, of course. I was a huge fan of Superboy. I was a huge fan of the Legion. I was a huge fan of both. And then there came a thing. There came a thing called Crisis on Infinite Earths, an event that DC did because they mistakenly thought that their past issue continuity, their 40 years of continuity, was too complicated to attract new fans. That absolutely was not true. They did not have one single verifiable attestation of that being true. Not one single letter sent to them saying your continuity is too complicated. That was simply not true. They just decided to do it. So they wiped out their previous continuity and established a new one in the last issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And in that new continuity, and in the new Superman that was launched in the wake of it, there was never any Superboy. Superman put on his Superman costume as an adult and started fighting the forces of evil in Metropolis. And those of us who had been Superboy fans and Legion fans looked at that and said, what? What are you talking about? If he was never Superboy, what are all these things? Well, at the time, I had a footlocker full of Superboy comics. What are they? And if he wasn't around to inspire the Legion, then where's the Legion? I have all of their comics too. What's going on with them? No one thought it out. I'm sure that the dumb writers conference at DC Comics that thought up Crisis on Infinite Earths would have got around to figuring out a workaround of Superboy and the Legion, except probably the Michelob Light ran out. So it floundered. And in addition to that, there was some sort of murky lawsuit. Michael K. Vaughan will probably know more of the details than I do. There was some sort of murky lawsuit as to whether or not DC Comics could use Superboy. You'd think they certainly could, because Superboy is Superman when he was a boy. And DC Comics can sure as hell use Superman. But there was some shady dealing. If I remember correctly, the writer of Superman pitched the idea of Superboy, and DC Comics, Detective Comics, turned him down. And then he went off to war. He went off to fight World War II. And they decided on the success of Robin that they did, in fact, want a teenage Superman, and started printing it without getting into any kind of an arrangement with him. And that's no small thing, because he would already have seen how popular Superman was. Wouldn't take a rocket scientist to know that probably a teenage Superman would be equally popular. You're going to want a contractual piece of that. I think there were lawsuits back and forth because of that. As in all lawsuits, as in all cases, the corporation is the one who was wrong. They done him wrong. They were evil and are still. Corporations are always evil. But nevertheless, I don't know if that ever got settled, but DC Comics had moved on. They definitely wanted to use the name Superboy, but they wanted to get him away from the idea of Superman when he was a boy. So, during a really dumb storyline in which Superman appears to die, he is succeeded by 4 alternate Supermen of one kind or another, and one of them is a boy wearing a leather jacket. And he turns out to be a clone of Superman, an imperfect clone of Superman. He's a clone of Superman, but he doesn't have Superman's powers. Tell me how that works. But anyway, that clone is this Superboy. And he was a fan favorite. Fans loved him right away. He was the most popular of the 4 ersatz Supermans that shows up in the wake of the death of Superman. He got his own book. Went on from there. He evolved. He eventually visited Krypton and got a Kryptonian name, Kon-El. And that character is now what? How long ago is this? That character's probably 40 years old by now. And there's also another Superboy, Superboy Prime, and a few others. But this is the one that fans know and love. When they think of Superboy, this is who they think of. They don't think of my Superboy. They don't think of this Superboy. They think, there he is. He's gone bad. He's thinking of running, ruining, wrecking, and ripping. They don't think of him. And, I don't think DC Comics does either. This character has been so buried in subsequent chronology, subsequent continuity, a lot of it popular, that I don't think that DC Comics would ever want. I don't think they were even worrying about however a lawsuit was settled, because I don't think they would ever want to go back to that character. They've made a few feints in the direction of saying, despite what we've said, the Legion did get inspired by Superboy. There was actually a Superboy now in DC continuity. They were inspired by him, but I don't think they've ever wholeheartedly gone back and told that story. And God forbid they ever do. I don't want a Legion of Superheroes relaunched with a number 1. I don't want to see that at all. I don't want anything. I don't want any part of the stuff, the old stuff that I've shown you, to be touched by DC at all. Just leave it alone. Just leave it completely alone. But the thing is, in this case, I don't think that DC would want to do it either. Although they do celebrate the character. I mean, they are allowed to do that. I'm pretty sure that legally, at least, they're allowed to put out books like this. This is Superboy, a celebration of 75 years. This thing starts off with my Superboy. And then moves on to all the various incarnations of Superboy. And one thing I want to point out from the Superboy from the 1950s, he's a bit of a hottie. He's just a bit of a hottie. And I don't know if you were... it's the super dog of Metropolis. If you are from Krypton, if you were... look at that panel there. That is adorable in a couple of different ways. If you were an impressionable young boy, that might hit you in just the right spot at just the right time. the introduction to this thing, it's not credited, and I don't blame you because it's really bad. They say Superboy is, after all, the ultimate wish fulfillment character. As a reader, who wouldn't want all the powers of Superman with none of the adult responsibilities? And as a writer, all those abilities and none of that experience means endless story possibilities. And that is what you got. But then, as this anthology goes on, you get the other Superboys, the grim existential Superboys from later comics, some of which made for interesting readings. The clone Superboy, this thing, I bought every issue of this when it came out, and I thought it was really entertaining. The character of Con-El, was so different from my Superboy that it didn't feel like a desecration at all. It was just admittedly a different character. And this is around this point in an Epic Comic Book Wednesday video when I would start to talk about how I would love it if DC Comics would launch Adventure Comics #1, have an 8-page front story and a 6-page backup story, and have the 8-page front story be Superboy, the adventures of Superman when he was a boy. Just start telling Superboy stories again. This is ordinarily where I would do that. Put a really good artist on it. To hell with continuity. Don't talk about other heroes. Don't talk about anything going on in the DC universe at the time. Just do that. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe that if DC did that, it would sell like crazy. But they're not going to do it, and I'm not, in this instance, I'm not saying that they should. I don't really want them to. Just leave things the way they are. There is an enormous backlog of Superboy, an enormous. Adventure Comics and Superboy comics have countless issues. And DC is learning. They have listened to Michael K. Vaughan. They are starting to improve their reprint game. In fact, by leaps and bounds. If you look at the sales figures, it's incredible. Their sales figures, not really for their comics except these new Absolute line, but for their reprint volumes, those compact issues like I showed you with Kingdom Come, and also their new full-color reprint line, they are dominating the market over their competition, Marvel Comics, which used to be really good at reprints. DC has just learned that's where the money is. It's not in your current stuff. It's in reprinting your old stuff. So if DC really has, one, I mean, God, I hope that they treated the Siegel and Schuster families well. But if they really have won the right to use the name Superboy and to revive the concept of the character, then I don't want a new Adventure Comics starting at #1. Where Ma and Pa Kent are turned into Ma and Ma Kent. I don't want that at all. Instead, what I wouldn't give for Michael K. Vaughan style $125 hardcover omnibus editions of Adventure Comics and Superboy. Just do a whole advancing line of both of those. Wouldn't that be great? Oh, man. And I guess DC can do it. If they can do a reprint volume, the reprint volume that I'm pretty sure that Mike got it, that reprint volume is not like this. It's not taking you through different incarnations of Superboy. It's all from the 1950s and early 1960s. So if they can do a volume like that and just reprint that character, then surely they can do them all. I would love it. Absolutely. I fell in love with comics through this character. And then the Legion. So anyway, that's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. It's Superboy. The real Superboy. My Superboy. How wonderful. What a treat. So I'll wrap this up for now, and we'll see what we do next week. Thank you, BookTube.